few years ago, I was working as a church administrator in Uptown Waterloo. Our neighbor on one side of our building was the liquor store, and on the other side of us was a fairly well-known funeral home in town. I'm not sure whether there was any significance or hidden message to the location of our church building in relation to both of our neighbors, but I will say that our location made for some interesting traffic and interesting conversations over the years that I worked there. Between the church building and the liquor store was a fairly wide laneway, and that led to a big open parking lot. So between that and the fairly well-maintained church grounds around the building, even though they were small, they were well kept and cared for. The location did tend to be somewhat of a drawing card for panhandlers. After I'd been there for a little while, I started noticing two people in particular that were what we became to call our regulars. And I'll call them Albert and Amy for now. Now, Albert always sat against the building on the LCBO side of that laneway, and Amy sat on the edge of the church grounds. They each had their own side and they kept to it. I don't honestly know whether either of them was technically homeless, but given the number of hours that they hung out around the church every day, it was fairly obvious that neither of them had a job. And when I say that I noticed them, I mean that in the most basic sense. I realized they were there. And honestly, that's about it. I would make brief eye contact sometimes, and I would smile, but I didn't make any real effort to interact with either of them in any way beyond that. Now, some of my responsibilities at the church gave me the opportunity several times a week to take a brief walk, whether it be down to the bank or go to the post office or go to the hardware store down the street to pick up supplies for the church or the custodian. And each little jaunt outside meant that I passed by both Albert and Amy, one on one side of the lane and one on the other. It wasn't long in taking those jaunts that I realized that pretty much every time someone passed either one of them, they spoke. It was maybe just a short hello or good morning, ma'am, or have a nice day today. The first few times I responded with some hesitation because secretly and honestly, I was waiting for the ask. Spare change, ma'am? But it never came. Not once. Not from either one of them. Now, this went on for a little while, and one day on my return from the bank, I noticed that Amy had what looked like a small basket in front of her and a small pile of stones that I'd say the stones were maybe about the size of an egg. As I got closer, I found myself quickly scanning the church grounds because part of the landscaping was small rocks. And I honestly wasn't sure where else Amy would have gotten rocks like that or what she was planning to do with them from that pile. And as I looked, there in the garden along the church wall was my answer. Along the edge of the gardens, small rocks had been placed carefully, each one colorfully decorated with hearts and flowers and simple messages like bless you, smile, have a great day. So I walked up to take a closer look and I couldn't help but smile. I turned to Amy and I just asked simply, did you do these? Yes, she said very simply. And she got up and she came over to me. And I told her that they were lovely. And I really liked how she had placed them along the edges of the garden. And she smiled. And for the next few moments, we chatted. We just chatted. About the rocks, yes, she had gotten them from the church grounds, and she was coloring them and putting each one of them back. She had started with just a few crayons, but they were wearing out, and some kind soul who'd gone past realized what she was doing and went and got her some markers. She said lots of people were stopping to talk to her when they saw what she was doing, and that was the part that she liked about coloring the rocks the most, the fact that people stopped and talked to her. So at that point, I asked her if I could know her name. And I'll admit in that moment, I was a little bit ashamed of myself, because after months of walking right by her almost every day, I didn't have a clue what her name was. So she told me. And then I asked her if there was anything she needed or wanted so that she could keep on coloring. And all she could come up with was a red marker. The one that she had was drying out, and red was her favorite color. So if I could find her a red marker, she would really appreciate that. Now, a day or two later, Albert greeted me with his polite, "Good morning, ma'am." And then he smiled and asked if I'd seen the rocks that Amy had done and put around the church tree. So I stopped and I shared with him that yes, I had, and that the church gardener had been thrilled to see them there. And there in that moment, another door was opened for yet another curbside chat with yet another person that I had walked past far too often and hadn't really seen. And he asked me for nothing. Other than in conversation, he mentioned that if the opportunity ever came along to help do any yard work around the church or any help that the custodian might need, he'd love to do it. And he wasn't interested in doing it for money. He simply wanted to do it so that he could feel useful again. And I realized then that in all likelihood, Albert was at least part of the reason that the church property was noticeably free of litter at times when the church volunteers hadn't been able to come by and do things like pick up the trash from the weekend or put away those garbage bags or take those fallen apart compost bags and put them into a pile. Somebody had to do it. Gardeners hadn't been able to come. Custodian wasn't there yet. I suspect it was Albert. In our scripture reading this morning, Jesus is telling one of his parables, a story that teaches us or can teach us something about ourselves. In this story, a shepherd or king in some version is separating the sheep from the goats. The sheep go on his right, they will inherit the kingdom. The goats on his left will not. And you might wonder right off the top, as I did, why sheep and goats? Well, that might make more sense when we consider some of the basic differences between the two. You see, sheep really can't live on their own. Well, maybe live on their own, but not thrive. They need a shepherd. They seem to know, the sheep seem to know how much they need the shepherd. So they follow the shepherd closely. They go where the shepherd leads them. They eat where the shepherd tells them. They do what the shepherd tells them to do. Now the goats, on the other hand, totally different story with the goats. Goats are stubborn. They do things their own way. They'll eat anything, even trash. Ever known anyone that seems to thrive on trash talk? Kind of brings to mind a recent very public election campaign, don't you think? But I digress. Goats don't seem to know or realize how much they need a shepherd. And if they do, they certainly aren't going to admit it and act like it. So they don't always follow the shepherd. This parable that Jesus is telling spells out a very basic guideline of how to follow and serve Christ. In simple terms, we serve Christ by serving others, feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, welcome the stranger, clothe the naked, take care of the sick and the imprisoned. In the New Revised Standard Version, just as you did it to one of the least of those who are members of my family, you did it to me. And from Contemporary English, whenever you did it for any of my people, no matter how unimportant they seemed, you did it for me. The least of these, not ever to be confused with less desirable or less deserving or unworthy. When I first started working at the church in Waterloo, going on my regular outings, I wasn't mean or rude or nasty to Amy or Albert. In many ways, I was actually much worse. In the beginning, I completely ignored them. I treated them like they really didn't exist. In my world, they didn't exist. It actually might have been better if I had been nasty or rude or mean. In some way, good or bad, at least acknowledge that they were human beings. By not doing so, all I did by ignoring them was add yet another brick to the prison walls they were already living behind. A prison of isolation and rejection. Acknowledging someone's existence, someone's basic humanity, seeing them as a person feeds in a very necessary and very simple way a hunger that has absolutely nothing to do with food that you buy at the store. Because you see, they too are children of God. They too are sheep. Our caring is not just limited to people. It is to be extended to all of creation. In children's time, we talked about pets, and it goes far beyond that. Think of the bumblebees. Just think of the bumblebees and everything they do for creation. And now go from the bumblebees to dandelions. Oh yes, the avid gardeners, the bane of their existence. Every perfect lawn manicurist hates dandelions. But they are one of the first flowers of spring. They're certainly one of the first foods for a dandelion in the spring. And we are slowly killing them off with chemicals on our lawns and on our roadsides. And why? Because we don't like the look of them. We've decided that one of God's first flowers of spring, one of God's first food providers for what turns out to be an essential piece of our food chain, the bumblebee, we've decided it's a weed. So it has to go. And it doesn't stop there. We continue to encroach on, to rob creatures of their natural habitats. And what for? So we can build more buildings, so we can build more condos, so we can build more housing, so we can build more malls, more big box stores. We can build more places to what? Use up farmland, to cut down trees, to destroy natural habitats. And when we do that, we take away their homes. And then when these creatures that we've taken away their homes, when they enter our domain, when they dare do that, when coyotes come into the city limits, when a beautiful fox runs through your backyard, wild turkeys maybe even come to your front step for seed. Bears in northern communities, not that far from here really, are finding themselves traveling from the dump into town. When those animals come looking for food, we treat them as if they are the trespasser. How are we being anything like the shepherd in doing any of that? How are we taking care of the least of these in doing any of that? Sometimes it is hard to draw the line between being a sheep and being a goat, especially when it comes to animals, especially when it comes to squirrels. Now, I know that many of you have bird feeders. You've probably learned, as I have, that bird feeders are a magnet for squirrels. I have pretty well given up the battle with the gray ones and the black ones, to the point where I now even put out a water dish for them when the weather gets warm so that they can have something to drink. I mean, if they're going to figure out how to completely empty my supposed squirrel-proof bird feeders, then they might as well have something to wash it down on. The last thing I need is a squirrel choking to death on my back deck because he has too many seeds in his mouth and I wouldn't give him a drink of water to wash it down. Yeah, so the gray ones and the black ones, they run rampant through my backyard. But the red squirrels, oh, that's a different story. And we actually haven't really had a problem with red squirrels here until this fall. And it wasn't a them problem, it was one. It was one very annoying, very persistent red squirrel. And it had somehow found its way down through one of our steel roof tiles up into the rafters of our family room. And I know it was there. I could hear it, and for several days, Stitches knew it was there. And she stood guard. She was in constant alert for days. I swear that cat didn't sleep for days. She stood in that family room staring at the ceiling because she knew something was up there. She could hear it and she couldn't get at it. But in order to solve that problem, Jim first had to figure out how was this ingenious but very annoying little red squirrel, how was it getting in and out? So one day up the roof he goes, and as he'd read on the internet, one way to find out their path of entrance and exit is to stuff wads of paper in the gaps. And you leave them there overnight or a couple of days, whatever it takes, to figure out where they're coming and going. Because if they're in there and they need to get out, they're going to push the paper out. If they're out and they want to get in, they're going to try and move the paper so that they can open up that doorway. So that's how you indicate where their doors are. Stick paper in the holes. Okay, so he figures out where he thinks the problem is. So a couple of days later, he goes back up on the roof, and then he has to go through the task of lifting off the tiles and finds where he thinks the problem is and gets extra screening and everything he needs, and he thinks he's got the problem fixed. He leaves the paper stuffed in the other spots just in case this tricky little squirrel has, like, you know, secret entrances or something. Maybe it's like a James Bond squirrel, who knows? And while he's up there, because once you've got the squirrel out, you got to do something with it. I mean, it's going to figure out how to get back in there somehow. So he sets a live trap on the top of our roof. Okay, so he comes back down off the roof, sets up a chair in the backyard, and he goes to set watch. He is going to wait this red squirrel out, and he's going to watch where it comes from, and he's going to figure out where it's going. And the minute that squirrel goes in that baited trap, he's got him. Okay, so after several evenings and hours of watching this squirrel go back and forth across the roof and all the gymnastics that are involved in that. Finally, the squirrel, this nasty little red squirrel, enters the trap. Great. Great. Now there is a red squirrel in a trap on my roof. That's great. So just exactly what does one do with that? Well, according to Google, in order to get rid of the squirrel, you need to take it a minimum of 20 kilometers from your home, during which time you have to cross at least one river. That's to minimize the risk of that squirrel not coming back to your house. 20 kilometers and one river. And no, I'm not kidding. So first things first, the cage is still up there. So we have to get the cage down off the roof without dropping the cage, in which case the trap door would likely open and then the squirrel would get back out, and then we're right back to square one with a very mad squirrel now, probably digging a new hole furiously as Jim finds his way up off the ground if he has dropped the trap. Or B, having a very mad squirrel in a trap peeing all over you as you are trying to come down a ladder to get this squirrel into the truck to take it for a car ride 20 kilometers away. Okay, check, done. Got the squirrel trap off the roof. Now for the car ride. Okay, so we've got this live trap, and this squirrel, who is not very happy about being in there, is in this trap. So we decide it would be less traumatic for the squirrel if we can find a box that the cage will go in. Well, as luck would have it, I had ordered something that came and the box was perfect. And so into the box goes the cage. So cage fits nicely in the box. It's not going to wiggle around. It's nice and dark in there. We figure it's going to be like a meditative state for the squirrel, calm it down for the car ride it's about to take. So on Sunday evening, Jim heads out around 9 o'clock. Off he and the squirrel go. So it was over an hour later before he gets back. I'm starting to wonder just exactly where did you take this squirrel? Did you two go out for dinner? Did you go for drinks afterwards? I don't know. So anyway, he comes home. And when he gets into the house, I learned that not only did he go 20 kilometers from the house, several more than that actually, crossed more than one railway track, 2 rivers, and the 401 with the squirrel. So then he finds a quiet stretch of road near a bushy area because he didn't want the little fella just to be left out in an open field or a paved parking lot. He pulls over, he pulls the trap out of the box and puts it on the ground and opens up the door, and he's fully expecting at this point that, like, okay, so he's been gone like 40 minutes with this squirrel in this box in the back of the truck, and it's probably a little bit, not happy right now. So the squirrel, I don't know, maybe it liked it back there because it didn't seem to want to leave the cage. So it took him a while to get the squirrel out of the cage. And when it did get out of the cage, he figured, oh man, it is just going to dart like the wind off into the bush. No, kind of meanders off over the ditch and stops and kind of takes a look, and, maybe it was saying goodbye to Jim and thanks for the ride. I don't know. Thanks for the treats. And off it goes into the bush. And when Jim was telling me all of this, he said that as he was driving back, the thought actually occurred to him, well, I hope the little guy's okay. Now, I hope some owl doesn't swoop down and get him before he finds a place to sleep tonight. And by this point, I'm sorry, but I was laughing to the point of tears. And I said, well, maybe I should have packed him a lunch for his first night away from home. Do you think he'll send us a card when he gets settled in his new place? But I guess even the squirrels fall into the category of the least of these. We are called to be sheep. to follow and do what Jesus would have us do, to help others, all of creation, even when, maybe especially when, they can't give anything back in return. In doing so, when we're helping others, it's kind of like helping Jesus in disguise. As we move into the coming week, moment by moment, may we each choose to be a sheep. May we each choose to follow that good shepherd. Be well, my friends. Stay safe. Take care of yourself and take care of one another. Amen.